And we are live. Today we have the first and probably not only, but the first Hindu live to appear on my channel. Your name is Arjuna. How do you pronounce your name?
Arjuna.
Arjuna Gallagher. And Arjuna, you want to introduce yourself to the people? Tell us who you are and what you do and why.
So I was born in New Zealand. I moved to Canada when I was 8. Grew up there essentially and moved back to New Zealand when I was 19. So I have a full Kiwi accent, except I will always call petrol gasoline. And when I was a Christian growing up, I was also quite philosophical. I was reading a bit of Socrates and stuff like that. And eventually I found Christianity unsatisfying because the philosophical answers were lacking.
Right.
I always believed in God my entire life, but then when I was 21 in New Zealand, I met the Hare Krishnas, and the first class I gave made complete sense. The philosophy made a lot of sense to me, answered a lot of questions. I started reading the books, hearing more classes, and eventually I was chanting Hare Krishna and had shorter hair and shaved my facial hair.
Wow. So what are they exactly? Are they, because how we think of them as the people in the airports, is that a different thing or is that the same thing?
I just want to get the live stream and share it on my channel if that's all right.
Yeah, that's fine.
So yeah, there's not a lot that's known about Hare Krishnas these days. We're mainly remembered for being at the airports and
right. Did you see Airplane? Did you ever see the movie Airplane? Those were Hare Krishnas, right?
Yeah. There's a cool YouTube channel
where you're like, my friends. Wait, those are my people. He's disrespecting us. Go ahead.
There's a cool YouTube channel where it's called Hare Krishnas in the Movies, where you can watch all the outtakes of different movies that have featured Hare Krishnas in them. It's quite entertaining.
And it's always disparaging, right? It's always like a diss on them. Correct?
Yeah, we're a cult. We wear the orange bed sheets or the white bed sheets. Sometimes they're even yellow. And when we're not wearing bed sheets, we're wearing pajamas. You know, like the sort of Indian pants that people wear. Right. But in reality, it's a tradition that goes back thousands of years in India. And philosophically, it's the most prominent part of what you would now call Hinduism. The word Hinduism is a real misnomer. It doesn't really mean anything. It's a geographical designation the Muslims would refer to the people who lived on the other side of the Sindhu River as Sindhus. I can't remember. There was a progression of mispronunciation. I'm not sure if it started with the Muslims, and eventually it became Hindu because the Greeks dropped the H and dropped the S and replace it with an H. So basically, all it really means is people that live, geographically, religions that come from India that use the same names and the same stories.
Right. But so there's a collection. It's a collection of religions rather than a specific. Is that what you're saying?
It's a collection of religions. Yeah, they have a few things in common, but in terms of looking at it philosophically rather than just based on names, if you look at it philosophically, you've got as much religious diversity inside Hinduism as you find outside of Hinduism.
Right. And what's your particular? First, tell us how you became your particular strand and what it actually means, like as simply as possible. I know it's really complicated, but the simplest version.
So I hadn't come in contact with any other Hindus at all until I met the Hare Krishnas, and it's called Vaishnavism. That's the technical name, or more specifically, we call ourselves Chaitanya Vaishnavas. There's a few different branches that we respect as coming from the same tradition, but they sort of have slight different views. Right. But more or less, it's the same thing. Just like you get different denominations of Christianity. Right. So basically, we see Krishna as God. We just see that as another name for God, and there's names for God in Christianity, and names for God in Islam and Judaism, and they're all talking about the same person.
So is Krishna kind of very similar to? Because I noticed that I was doing I'll just briefly tell you this, but there's a common atheist talking point. They can't all be right, but they can all be wrong. And one of my things is like sometimes there are hidden similarities between these religions that you don't even notice. Like, for example, I don't know if Brahman and Krishna are the exact same thing, but there's a way you can frame Brahman that it's identical attributes to Yahweh. And you wouldn't know the difference if you were just talking about the attributes. So I don't know if that's the same thing with Krishna. Is Krishna kind of like God, capital G? Is that how that works? And it's kind of monotheist or no?
Well, Lord Brahma wouldn't fit with Yahweh because he's a secondary creator.
Okay.
He's like an engineer employed to do the creation. Krishna means the all attractive one. So I assume your conception of God, you consider him to be the most attractive.
Right.
He's full in all opulences. So there's 6 opulences. I usually miss one of them. I'll pull up a list.
6. Did you ever study Christian theology, by the way?
I mean, not extensively. Like I went to Sundays. I went to like a youth group and we had lots of discussions and read the Bible a little bit.
Okay.
But
and there was never an in-between phase where you became like an atheist or a secular person?
Nah, I never. No, I believed in God my entire life.
Okay.
At one point I was eclectic, and at one point I was a Christian, and then eventually I figured I took it that Krishna Consciousness has a comprehensive understanding of God, and the other religions, they have bits and pieces.
Okay, so what's Krishna Consciousness, and how would you've defined Krishna sort of, and is that's related to Krishna Consciousness, right?
Yeah, so we see it that this material world is a place for us to reform our rebellious mentality. We've chosen to turn our backs on God. A really nice analogy that describes it as a father whose child doesn't want to play with him anymore. He wants to go to the park and play with his friends. So the father takes the child to the park and sits on the park bench and lets the child play, all the while watching him. And the moment the child says, "Daddy, I want to go home," then the father picks up the child and carries him home. So God's waiting for that moment where we're going to turn back to him. And this world is set up in such a way that we can exhaust our selfish desires and eventually become sick of them and turn back to God and figure out that what's really going to satisfy us is a loving, service-filled relationship with God. So a big emphasis for us is serving God. Like you get some Christians who, they're like, "Oh, I prayed to God and he didn't cure so-and-so's cancer, therefore I'm losing my faith." Whereas I know not all Christians are like that, but
right.
we see it that, like it's fine to pray for things, but God may or may not reciprocate with your prayers. And the real thing is for us to serve God. And that's what really brings us satisfaction.
Right.
And
there's
God,
definitely there's preachers who would preach against that. A lot of standard American cultural defects enter into Christianity and people don't realize it. So they like pray for like the car and the house and things like that. But there are definitely Christians who are more committed who would say that that's how their life is as as a service to God, and that's really what they're all about. Are you more religious than your typical? Are you how devoted would you say you are? Strong?
Oh, then your typical Hare Krishna. People who become Hare Krishnas, it generally becomes a pretty big part of their life, which I think differences it from a lot of religions. Like,
so it's a total immersion conversion. It's a total thing.
That's pretty common. I mean, there is a bit of a problem. I mean, it's a new religious movement, so we always get a bit of fanaticism. Like you can imagine the early Christians after Jesus left. So we had Prabhupada, who's like we use the phrase Bhagavad Acharya, like really potent prophet. And he left in 1978. We've got his books, and so basically the Hare Krishna movement started in the West in the 60s, and so it's a young movement, which means there's a bit of fanaticism. So I'd say there's a little bit too much of that, or maybe we're going too far the other way. But the philosophy allows for people to just add the littlest bit to their life, and they still get eternal benefit for what little bit they add, and they can add any amount they want. But there is a tendency that if someone has been around for a little while and they haven't totally taken the whole thing full hog, it's like, what's wrong with you? Like, why aren't you getting your act together and surrendering more? Which I think is a bit of a problem because it pushes people away.
Right, because in I don't know how much you know about Buddhism, but there's a secular version of Buddhism that gets practiced in the United States, which is almost like a meditation. It's very different from Buddhist, like actual Buddhism that gets practiced. It's like there are people like Robert Wright and even Sam Harris who call themselves Buddhists, but I don't know if they'd be recognizably Buddhist to actual, people in Tibet who are like Tibetan monks and stuff. So is there some of that? Are you practicing like a Western version, or are you practicing, as far as you're concerned, as far as like your typical Hare Krishna would be concerned, the real deal?
It would be considered the real deal. I mean, there is this thing called Krishna West, which some people take as heretical, because there's some Hare Krishnas who think that you have to wear the bed sheets in order to really advance spiritually, but there's no scriptural basis for that. It's just like something they happen to believe. I mean, it would be equivalent to if you had, Christians today that were dressing like how Christians dressed 2,000 years ago and saying that's what you have to do if you really want to advance spiritually.
Oh, I get you. Okay, so I had a friend who was convinced he was going to become like, I forget what he called it, a Nazarene or something. He was going to take these Nazarene vows and he wasn't going to drink grape juice and he was going to grow his beard. And I was like, dude, that just ain't happening. It was some sort of like wacky, he had some sort of idea. Now, one of the things you said to Aaron Ra, you were trying to do a kind of apologetic that about religion in general. And I don't know if you framed your particular religion this way, but what was the thing that you said? That there was similarities between all the world religions. Do you remember what I'm talking about?
Oh, the elephant analogy.
There was that one, but then there was the things that they all agree upon.
Oh yeah, I can pull that list up. My last video I published was on that subject.
Yes, that seems to be a common subject of yours. But yet you've never heard of perennial philosophy, right?
I looked it up. I have heard it. Yeah, I wasn't familiar with the name. I looked it up after you mentioned it, and that does make sense.
It's similar. It's kind of similar to where you're at, or no?
Well, in Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says 2 verses in a row, which is basically like wherever and whenever there's a decline in religious principles and an increase in sinfulness, I'll descend and reestablish religious principles.
Right. So there are some. I mean, there's some. You were a Christian, so there are some similarities, right, between. Are there or no? I mean, there's some similarities in terms of...
There's definitely some similarities. I mean, I figured out why I find the term Hindu so annoying, and it's because it gives you it's really misleading in terms of what our philosophy is like, because when you think of Hindus, you think of you get Hindus who are atheists or like Buddhists, right. And you get Hindus who are like ancestor worshippers, and then you get some that are like pantheists and some that are like voidists or impersonalists, and they think that, you focus on Krishna or Ganesh or Brahma, and that's just something to fix your mind on now because we can't focus on nothing. And when you really become advanced, then you realize that the absolute is this sort of warm, fuzzy effulgence. Whereas it'd be more accurate to put us in the same category with Christians.
As a monotheist who are dedicated to your deity.
Like, correct? We've got all these, we believe...
Like, whereas I live my life in service of Christ, or at least I'm supposed to. You're living your life in service of Krishna. Is that kind of what you mean?
And we even have a concept, I mean, it's a bit different from Christianity, but it's considered better to serve the devotee of God than to serve God directly.
So you would serve the priest? Is that what you kind of mean?
Well, it often translates to serving the guru, but really what it means is anyone who's dear to God, even if they're in another religion. So serving that person, and someone who's dear to God.
You could fulfill your vows by serving me, for example.
Yeah, in theory. I mean, it depends on the level.
In theory or in practice,
It depends on the level of God consciousness. So
around my house.
Well, when somebody is a pure devotee, like you pick, let's take Saint Francis as an example. I don't think anyone would argue that he wasn't really dear to God.
Right.
And then serving him doesn't mean like, doing his housework. That's not the way you serve Saint Francis.
Right. That's the way you're going to serve me. I didn't say the same.
But I mean, it can like if the senior devotee or the advanced devotee is busy with another service, then you might do menial services for them. Like, when the guru is leaving their body, it also means like being like a nurse and like doing all sorts of menial service for their body,
kind of like Elijah and Elisha. Do you know that Bible story?
I'm not familiar with that one. No.
Well, it sounds like a very similar paradigm. So is that something you're doing right now? Or is there someone that you're like who's a guru that you're kind of in service of, or no?
Well, it's serving. I mean, you could say that, except he's in America at the moment. But serving generally means serving the instructions. And for someone who's devoted their life to God, serving them their instructions means serving God's instructions. It just makes it more personal. Like if there's something in the scripture that says, God tells you to do this, it's one thing. But if there's a person in front of you saying, like, I'll give you initiation into the spiritual realm and I'll give you instructions and I'm asking you to do this thing, it's a lot more compelling.
Right. So okay, so there are other similarities between Christianity, did you say, or no?
Other similarities, I mean, the service to the devotee. We accept Jesus as a great prophet. Some devotees think he's an incarnation of a form of God. I'm not sure what to think about that because the scriptural basis for that is shaky. It comes from a scripture which could be interpolated. Somebody could have just come along and inserted Jesus into it after the fact. So
you're talking about the scripture from your book. Which book are you?
The Vedas have a lot of books. So
right, I knew that.
We consider that most of them have lost their integrity, like they've been interpolated, they've had things removed or added, or at least we can't know if they have or not. Whereas we've got a few books like Bhagavad Gita and Srimad Bhagavatam, where even scholars who aren't part of our tradition will acknowledge that this book is intact. Like, you get various Bhagavatam manuscripts and you compare them, and there's like a couple of syllables different in a few places. It's like, okay, the book's intact.
So how does your faith manifest itself as a daily thing? Is it more you've got a guru who you're inspired by, and that's how you practice, or is it text related, or is it prayer related? Like, what would you say for you personally? And is that different than other Hindus?
I mean, like anyone who's within a Vaishnava tradition, to make it be broad, is very different from every other Hindu. But in terms of within Hare Krishnas, I start work quite early. So, the ideal thing is to chant Hare Krishna on beads 16 rounds a day. Right. It takes an hour and a half to 2 hours for most people. If you're quick, it can take an hour. And so
wow, to go through your chants in the morning, it takes an hour? Or
minimum, yeah.
Wow.
You
do that every morning?
That's repeating the names of gods. Well, I start work early, so I don't do it every morning. I do some of it while I'm driving, which is not ideal. And then the rest of it I do once I get home while I'm watching the kids. But when you have small kids, you can't really expect to do everything in the ideal manner. You got to just survive and raise your kids well.
Yeah, I would totally imagine that. a lot of things that get compromised in terms of pure religious devotion because you got to raise your family in practical considerations. That's probably part of why Christianity is so successful, is that it was able to negotiate the ideal with the practical matters of raising kids and getting a job and things like that. There's probably, there's certainly that's a reason why Christianity took off in the West to a certain degree. But anyways, go ahead.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, you can miss. Jesus said that the spirit, the letter without the spirit kills. So when you misunderstand the spiritual instructions, it's actually really dangerous. Or a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing. So there can be a tendency to neglect your family or to say bad things about family life.
The letter kills and the spirit brings life. Yeah, I've used that scripture in my videos to point out about being really hardcore about some types of interpretations. That's what that scripture is directly saying. If you're too rigid in your interpretation, that's a form of death, and the spirit brings life. You're supposed to be led by the spirit. That's probably not that dissimilar from something you believe, right?
Yeah, that's exactly it. That's why it's so important to have, we use the word guru, but that's why it's so important to have a living person who is a living, breathing embodiment of the teachings. Because without that,
so you think this person is really holy in your terms, and he's operating on all five cylinders. Is that
yeah,
correct?
you need that person. So when we say take shelter of a guru, that's what we mean. And you can interpret that however you want. And there's a few symptoms that are given for somebody like that. I can't remember them off the top of my head, but one of them I gave in that debate with Aaron Ra, that they should be happy, they should be detached, and they should be perceiving something transcendental. Of course, you can't really verify if they're perceiving something transcendental, but when you can get some kind of an inkling that this person is God, they've got something that I want. Like people would say that about Prabhupada, who founded the Hare Krishna movement in the West, that we wanted what he had. Right,
totally. I remember that specifically because that's where one of the biggest disconnects, where he was pretending he was speaking gobbledygook, and I was like, dude, I'm not necessarily trying to be charitable to him, but it was easy to understand what you meant. You compared your religious practice to a meal. And that when he asked you, what's the proof of that Hinduism is the real deal? And you said, if you're practicing this, it was a variation on, you shall know them by their fruits. If someone is really practicing these things correctly, they're going to be detached from the material world. They're going to like carry themselves differently in a way that you seem to say would be, you know, very obviously spiritual and different than people who are connected to the rat race and like, you know, just out for a quick gain, things like that, right? That's kind of paraphrasing it correctly.
I mean, I'm pulling this as a direct quote from one of our scriptures from Srimad Bhagavatam, where it says, devotion, direct experience of the Supreme Lord, and detachment from other things. These three occur simultaneously for one who has taken shelter of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, in the same way that pleasure, nourishment, and relief from hunger come simultaneously and increasingly with each bite for a person engaged in eating.
Right. See, that brings to mind, like there's a Christian scripture, set your mind on things above and not the things of this world. So the same principle, that if you're walking in the spirit, it's going to be demonstrated by you. You're going to be a more spiritual person. I don't think Christians would say detached, but you're more like me. You know, you're really loving, kind, compassionate, you know, good.
Well, I think if you've got a priest who's like sexually agitated all the time, or, you know,
Right. If he's a jerk,
wants to drive a Ferrari, you know, like let's take some of those televangelists. Like, right, they've got private jets. It's like, is this person really God conscious? Like, why do they need 3 private jets?
Right, and that's why everyone gets tripped out by him, because to most people it's really obvious, or at least surfacely really obvious, that that's not a spiritual person, because they wouldn't really be about that. They'd be like more Mother Teresa, you know, going to places and building orphanages and helping handicapped kids and things like that. So it's a similar idea, right? I mean, it's a similar idea, and it's an easy to understand idea. And then what did he make of it? I don't even remember. He like
he didn't want to have that conversation. I was trying to have an epistemological conversation with him, and I mean, anyone who's tried to engage with Aaron Ra figures out pretty quickly that he doesn't really do epistemology. He does,
and he was just trying to, like, you know, set you up to basically try to make you look stupid. Or,
he's got his talking points that, you know, that are the way he harps on against, you know, theists. And if you find a philosophical flaw with one of his talking points, all he'll do is get angry. That was my experience. It's like, I was raising that, you know, how do you know you're not a brain in the vat thing? And he was thinking I was doing presuppositionalism, which is, you know, well, without God, we can't possibly know that we could know anything. You know, God has to exist to give us a rational mind. And I wasn't really arguing that. I was saying you already accept that you have a rational mind that's capable of knowing things. But on what basis do you accept that? You accept that on self-evidence.
Right.
And that means...
But he rules that out of the realm of possibilities when he's talking to the religious person. That's what you were trying to argue. And you were saying that one of the authenticators of your faith, the thing that was frustrating is that he wasn't trying to understand what you meant. His talking points may apply, but you can't say that it's a defeater if you're bringing it to the table inauthentically. Like, in other words, if he hasn't really heard you and doesn't understand what you mean, then it's not a real defeater, because he has no idea what you meant. He couldn't. I could paraphrase what you meant better than he could, you know, and he was...
Yeah, you know, he didn't take the time to understand my argument. I carried it out with him on comments on one of my videos.
Oh, you did?
I had dozens of comments of exchanges with him and a couple other atheists. I'll send you the link for the video where you can find those comments.
Is that the same debate?
That was the one called The Inconsistency of the New Atheists. The video where I point out that these people, well, it turns out Aaron Ra says that he's a strong atheist or a hard atheist or whatever you want to call it, that he believes that he knows God doesn't exist. As opposed to an atheist who thinks that, well, I'm just not convinced, like a Matt Dillahunty. Right. But then I found Cosmic Skeptic, Rationality Rules, and Aaron Ra all saying, because I found one video where Aaron Ra, that's what inspired me to do the video, where he's like, an atheist is someone who is not convinced that God exists. And then he goes on to say, everything that religion teaches is wrong. It's like, those two things contradict one another. Either you're not convinced, or you know that the claims are wrong. If you know that the claims are wrong, then you believe that God doesn't exist. And you've just said an atheist is someone who is just not convinced that God exists. It's like, you know.
Right. Well, he's Matt Dillahunty is better at not asserting things that he's going to, because he's in debate so frequently. And
yeah, I couldn't find one with Matt Dillahunty doing the same error.
You won't catch him doing that because he's aware of the fact that he's going to be in a public debate, not a debate on a channel that he's running, but a debate where he's against somebody on a stage and people are watching. And if he asserts something somewhere along the way, he's going to have to back that up. Somebody's going to find that and go, this is what you said here. And if it's some sort of cock and bull thing, then he's going to have to defend it. So he's aware when he's opening his mouth that he's going to be defending what comes out of it at some point or another. Right? That's how I see it anyways.
Yeah. Cosmic Skeptic and Rationality Rules don't do many debates either. I haven't managed to get any attention from either of them, but a Cosmic Skeptic, one of his videos, he was talking about, he's describing himself that he's not convinced, and they talked about the different categories, and someone who knows God doesn't exist, or so on. And then he said he put a category, someone who, anyway, he basically called people who think they know God exists an idiot. It's like, well, if they're an idiot, it means they're wrong, because if you think they could be right, you wouldn't call them an idiot. So that was him contradicting himself. Yeah. Anyway, we've kind of changed the topic. We were talking about epistemology. So I was trying to make this point to Aaron Ra that how do you, on the basis by which you understand that, the material world exists, other people are conscious. On that same basis, you can understand that there's a mind behind this world. Like you can have an intuitive experience that there's a conscious being greater than ourselves.
Yeah, and what was he saying to that? Because that seems
he wouldn't have that discussion. I tried to have that discussion because he was saying, "Well, how do you know it's true?" And I was saying, "Well, tell me how you know the material world exists, and then I'll tell you how I know God exists." And he's like, "I'm not going to tell you that we all know the material world exists. I'm not going to tell you how I know it exists." It's like, okay, but like.
Yeah, he didn't get it. He didn't realize that you were. A lot of times, atheists will fall apart on analogous statements like that because they literalize everything. So he didn't realize that you were actually kind of trying to indicate. Look, you see what I mean? That's why he fell apart on your meal analogy too, because they try to literalize. You were talking about you compared your faith to a meal, and it made sense to me. It didn't make any sense to Aaron Ra.
Yeah.
Because he's always trying to cut to the chase and go, well, just to run his playbook, so to speak. Now, there's a different epistemology to Hinduism, isn't there? Or there's an actual school of epistemology in Hinduism.
So when the British came to India, and the British were like the crown jewel of the sophistication of human evolution, right? Like,
right.
Nobody's advanced in culture or education or philosophy or science as much as the British. And then they come to India and they're like, these guys have more sophisticated philosophy and more sophisticated language than us. Geez. So they came up with a whole philosophy called the white Aryan invasion theory to whitewash all that and say that actually you guys got your sophistication from us because we invaded thousands of years ago and seeded the Vedic culture here, and now we're back again to give you an even better culture, Western culture. Look, become all Westernized like us, and now of course India's falling apart.
Have you been to India?
Yeah, I've been to India 3 or 4 times.
Really? Where'd you go?
Just Vrindavan, which is in Uttar Pradesh. It's the birthplace of Krishna, and Mayapur in West Bengal, which is the birthplace of Lord Chaitanya. So 2 of the main holy places for our tradition.
Wow, interesting. My wife is half English, actually. So I've been to England, but not India.
But yeah, so there's a really sophisticated philosophical structure. I mean, if you wanted to look at like theologies and philosophy, I think you've only got 2 places that originated their own original teachings. That would be the Middle East, which gives you Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and so on, and India, which gives you the Vedic canon. And with that, there's 6 different main schools. They're called the Saddarshans.
Right.
I can't name all of them, but one of them is Nyaya, which deals with epistemology. It's Nyaya means logic, basically. So there's a whole sophisticated explanation on hermeneutics. Like, if you read a scriptural statement and you can take the literal meaning, then you take the literal meaning. If the literal meaning can't be taken, like, there's a village on the Ganga, which is a river. Obviously, There's not a river on the Ganga or on the Yamuna. So, so obviously it must be on the banks of the river. that's how you do it. So if you always take the literal meaning if you can. If the literal meaning doesn't work, like that in that example, then you take an allegorical, like a metaphorical meaning. But some interpreters of the scriptures like to, when the literal meaning works perfectly well, say, oh no, we've got to take that metaphorically. It's like Krishna in Bhagavad Gita has a sentence where he uses the word me 6 times,
Right.
It's like, surrender unto me, take shelter of me. I can't remember the exact verse. And 6 times in one sentence he uses the word me. And then this impersonalist goes and says, he means the impersonal, that means the impersonal within Krishna. It doesn't mean actually Krishna. It's like, he used the word me 6 times. The literal meaning works that, the story is there's a person there, they shake hands, they're having a conversation. Like, how is it not obvious that we should interpret that as being God's a person and we should surrender to a person?
Well, so there's common sense involved, but there's the because the thing you just mentioned, what did you just say about
the river example?
Right, the river example. No, but what made me think of epistemology is you brought up something epistemologically that sounded very similar to like Reformed epistemology, wherein it's. Go ahead.
We actually have a term in Sanskrit which Lord Chaitanya used in a discussion he had with a Muslim ruler called swata pramana, which means self-evident truth. So the scripture proves itself. Self-evident epistemology is really not talked about much, and I think it's also misunderstood when it is talked about. And like William Lane Craig, who's an excellent debater, he'll use it without mentioning it. So he gives the moral argument. He says, premise 1, if objective morals values exist, then God exists. Premise 2, objective moral values exist. Conclusion, God exists. It's like, but how do we know objective moral values exist? We know that.
Well, that's the one that always gets that. But that's the one that always gets debated because people will insist that there is no such thing as objective moral values, and so that's where the debate comes in. Yeah, no, I totally agree.
And people have this debate, and nobody says it's self-evident. They're effectively saying we just know in our hearts that it's true, but nobody's actually talking about self-evident epistemology.
Well, so how does that apply to the Hindu thing? You were applying it to Hinduism specifically.
So we have a term that could be literally translated as meaning self-evident, which is swata pramana, meaning it proves itself. It has its own proof. So we apply that to the scripture and also to the sadhu. So one analogy for the meal example works. When you're eating a meal, you don't have to get some certificate to say you've eaten a healthy meal and it was yummy and you're full. Yeah, totally. You just know. And if somebody gave you a certificate that disagreed with what you know in your heart, you'd just burn the certificate. You'd be like, no, don't gaslight me. I know that meal wasn't yummy, wasn't satisfying, and didn't give me energy.
Right.
So in a similar way, like, one example that's used often is if you're eating green mangoes your whole life, you might think that you're eating ripe mangoes. Like it's possible to be deluded. Like people have psychosis and they misunderstand reality. But that doesn't disprove that some people have an ability to comprehend reality. It just means it's possible to be deluded. So we could be mistaken about reality on some levels, but then when we, read the scripture and come in contact with the pure devotee, then we understand, oh no, I was mistaken. Now I have real knowledge. Before I thought I had knowledge, but actually I had a mirage. I was misunderstanding. Now I have real knowledge, and it's self-evident, just like the mango example. As soon as you eat a ripe mango, you've been eating green mangoes your whole life, and this is the first time you've had a ripe mango, and this is actually a ripe mango. So with a spiritual tradition, how that plays out is, nobody should say, like people give Pascal's wager, and I think it's a brilliant argument, but I think you need to add to it that there should be some proof now. It shouldn't just be like, you take shelter of this spiritual knowledge, and when you die, you'll find out if it's true. But for now, you've just got to take it on faith. I don't think that works. And I think when we add the self-evident epistemology, we protect ourselves against drinking the Kool-Aid. Because if you always tell people, like, listen to your heart, and if it's, like, suspend your disbelief, associate with the devotees in the community, read the books, follow the practice, and see how you feel. And if you feel like this is right, then become more serious about it. If you don't feel like it's right, then keep looking. But, give it a shot.
That's partially a common sense thing. I mean, if all things being equal and like applied to Christianity, like if someone's in a church and their life is they're satisfied with what they're at in life, and they feel like they're getting a lot out of their Christian practice, and they're be a better person, and they're more spiritual. And Pine Creek Doug's answer to Laura was, you should still look for a defeater. And what you're basically saying is what I said, is like, why? Like, what's the point in that? Like, if it's working for you on some level, like there's a practical consideration here that it seems like you're talking about. Correct? Am I hearing you right?
I like to make parallel arguments. So, I managed to get Aaron Ra to accept that the standard of skepticism and epistemology, which we apply to science or to theology, it should be equal for both. And I see them as two different layers of reality, right? So if we use self-evidence to get the axioms of material knowledge, then why can't we use self-evidence to get the axioms of spiritual knowledge?
Right, but I understand why they would object to it, because it's not self-evident to them. Like I've made the analogy.
No, that's not true. It is so many of them admit that it is self-evident to them, but they reject it based on them giving primacy to materialistic science.
You've heard somebody say that? Really? I've never heard anybody actually say that.
Okay, well, Aaron Ra says, I had supernatural experiences when I was a neo-pagan occultist, and now I know that those were just produced by the brain.
Well, okay. So what's your analysis on that?
And Cosmic Skeptics said in a discussion with Michael Jones with Inspiring Philosophy that he did find God's existence to be intuitive. It's just when he investigated it logically, he concluded that God doesn't exist. So he'd said that God existing seems to be intuitive. And you get various other atheists saying the same thing, that, it seemed intuitive. What's his genetically modified skeptic has his story how he became an atheist, and he was a Christian, and he prayed to God on multiple occasions and had supernatural experiences where he felt God's presence and reciprocation with his prayers. And now he's just convinced that it's all produced by the brain. So, if you're going to say my experience of God is produced by the brain, then why not your experience of anything? Like, how do we know we're not all just having a mutual...
Yeah, that's definitely one of the big cognitive mistakes they make, is that if there's a supernatural experience, obviously it's going to have you can be able to detect it in the brain, because there's the natural portion of the experience. So yeah, it is being technically produced by your brain, just like when you eat, like when you bang your thumb with a hammer, it's, that's technically being produced by your brain too. But there's a tangible, concrete reality to it. That's kind of what you're saying, right?
Well,
Yes?
I mean, the epistemology for the different things is different. Like, if you want to find a dwarf star, there's a particular thing you look for when you point your telescopes into space. And you don't point your telescopes at the ground and say, oh, we pointed our telescopes in the ground and we didn't find any dwarf stars, so they don't exist. It's like, yeah, if you point your scientific instruments into the material world, you're not going to find a spiritual world. Like, come on.
Right. And it's a totally different type of cognitive process, that in totally different type of thinking process, it's, analytical A equals A thinking is not actually the avenue towards spiritual exploration. It's, it's a different way. It's a different type of thinking, but that doesn't make it more prominent or more important. That's how I say that. But I think it's sort of saying the same thing.
I've been planning to produce a video on this, but it's a really technical subject, and it's hard to make it robust so that skeptics can't just rip it to shreds, while simultaneously having it entertaining and engaging and not dry and overly technical and long.
I would go with robust and dry. People can handle it. I had this agnostic on my channel who was like Mr. Brainiac, and technically it was dry, but everyone was totally into him because it was like, because his technical, precise language was actually, people were impressed with him. So I would say go with it. Make it dull, precise, and technical. And then, if you convince some atheists, we'll shop it around on our channel and say, look, this guy hit it. So,
I'll send you the link for the demo. It's one of the first videos I was trying to produce, and I wasn't very good at making things engaging at that stage. I'll send you the demo, the draft I got out, and you can tell me what you think.
I'll give a wrench to Spartan. I don't know how to give wrenches. You guys got to talk to John if you want a wrench. I saw some cool questions. I'm going to look down here.
Someone was asking if I believe that there's a beginning to creation or if it's cyclical.
Yes, I saw that. That was Stephanie. Do you know Stephanie? Say hi, Stephanie.
Hi,
Stephanie's
Stephanie. No, I don't know Stephanie.
She's really popular in the atheist community. They love her.
Oh, cool. Where was I? Yeah, so we believe that creation is cyclical, that the material world gets created. It goes for a long time. It has partial devastations and gets created again. So this particular planet being 4 billion years old doesn't really contradict the narrative so much. If you could fit in there. So there's, and then there's a night, and it goes for a long time too, and we all go to sleep in the body of Mahavishnu if we haven't returned to the spiritual world, and then it gets created again. And while we're here, we take birth in various species of life, sometimes going to the heavenly planets and enjoying, sometimes coming down to these middle earthly planets and having a mixture of suffering and enjoyment, and sometimes going down to the hellish planets.
So that is gonna happen to you? You're gonna be what? What are you gonna be, a bug or something?
Well, if you're in the human form of life and you take proper advantage of it, then you get to become a human again. And if you take full advantage of it, then you go up to the next level, or you beat the game, and you get to leave the simulation and go to the real world, and have an eternal spiritual life where every step is a dance and every word is a song.
Interesting. Are you on track to do that? And how is that manifested?
That's the goal. That's the idea.
Is it a moral awakening, or is it a spiritual thing? Is it both combined?
There's a moral. Well, the ultimate thing is we have to be remembering Krishna, fixing our mind on God at the time of leaving our body. And to do that, we need to live a life dedicated to God. And there's various regulative principles which are favorable for fixing our mind on God. So, spending 12 hours a day at a casino, getting drunk, being addicted to cigarettes, being addicted to coffee, even these things distract us from God. Where the whole idea is to be remembering God 24/7.
Right. Keep your mind, fix your mind on things above. That's how we would say it.
And that's also sad. It's not just like some future goal where you do this thing and it's kind of painful and you hope it's true and you'll find out at the end of your life. It's actually, you can, what we could one leader called it dying without dying. You overcome your false ego and you become situated spiritually before even leaving this material body. It can even get to a point.
It's weird how similar those are to Christian concepts, where death to the flesh and where you're supposed to die to yourself, pick up your cross daily and follow me. That's what Jesus says.
Jesus was hardcore.
Yeah, totally hardcore. He wasn't kidding around. These guys think he was kidding, so they're like, "Oh, we're in." Yes. No. Do you? By the way, do you still read Christianity? Are you still interested in Jesus? And do you connect to him in prayer at all, or does he enter your prayer life or anything like that?
We've got plenty of spiritual personalities, and we've got too many. I don't know if you could have too many, but yeah. So there's not much of a focus on Jesus, or I don't know. Maybe some Christians who become Hare Krishnas keep more of it, but I'm pretty much just satisfied within what we have in Krishna consciousness. But I do listen to a lot of Christian apologists, and to be quite honest, I find it a bit painful when they start making arguments for Christianity, where they're really good at arguing for theism in general, but when they start getting specific about, their particular take on Christianity, it can be a bit painful.
Wait, so what are the good arguments for theism in general? You think there are some that you like?
Well, I like the moral argument. It's like, I really think it's difficult to have moral realism on naturalism, but the two don't just fit. You could have some kind of compatibilism, but I think compatibilism is just trying to shoehorn your worldview into a nihilistic ontology.
And so you're a moral realist, and that's interesting. I wouldn't have necessarily guessed that, but I guess you are.
Well, I think if you really boiled it down, our moral ontology is not exactly what you hear in a lot of the Christian apologist arguments. I don't know if that accurately represents the Christian ontology either, but it would appear from the Christian arguments that the moral ontology is that you have to do it because God commanded you to do it, whereas our ontology is the moral laws are almost like laws of physics. Like you can't have a world where people torture babies and expect that to work. So, there's a system where if you torture babies, you get to take birth as a baby who gets tortured. And that creates a perfect system where babies who deserve to get tortured only ever get tortured, which is not a reason to lack compassion. If somebody's suffering, you don't use karma to discredit their suffering. We don't know what they did in the past life, and we should just feel compassion. But so our moral ontology is more that it's a system that it's like it's just like the way reality is, where there's equal and opposite reactions for everything you do. So if you behave like an idiot, you're just not going to have a happy life. You need to follow certain things in order to get good results. Like there's certain principles about having a healthy marriage, and it's not like God's like made it like, I'm going to make it so people who behave like idiots in their marriage are going to get divorced and be miserable. It's like, no, it's just there's no other way to have a healthy marriage other than following these basic principles.
Right. Are those the Dharmic principles in Hinduism? I know there are things, but are they in
so there's Dharma, and Dharma is different for different people. So there's 4 different. I mean, the caste system is a really gross misunderstanding of the Varnashram system, which it's a degradation of. So the caste system in India today is like
still there. Right?
I think the Muslims and the British kind of ruined it. But I don't know how degraded it was before that. I'm pretty sure it wasn't. There was 700 years of Muslim rule, but before that, it was a system where there's 4 different categories, and according to your quality, so it doesn't matter who your parents are and what their qualities are, according to your nature. So some people have a nature for business where it's like no matter what they're doing, they just want to be increasing their wealth and producing more and producing more, and it's like. Those people are the people you want to have running the farms and, growing food for everybody. So in the Vedic society, the highest level Vaishya was somebody who grew food, and they're producing value for society. That's what their service is. And then there's artist people. So they create beauty, and they're a bit more simple-minded, and they have different dharmas. So that they're and then there's the government types, which are the Kshatriyas, and like traditionally in war, they were the ones leading the charge. And then you have the ideas people, or the Brahmanas, and they're the ones who would, have discussions and give teachings.
That's like the priestly caste, right? The Brahmanas.
Yeah, but you could even have a Brahmana who would teach how to fight in war. Basically, they would do teaching. They could teach anything. So just because somebody knew how to fight really well didn't mean they were a warrior. They could be a teacher. And for that person to fight in a battle is against their dharma, because all they're supposed to do is teach.
Right. That's like
break their caste when they do that.
Teach people how to kick, how to beat people up, but I don't actually bother doing it myself.
Right.
Send my minions out to kill in my name. Okay, here's the question that I wanted you to address, because this is actually an interesting question. There's an ontology in evil in Hinduism that's different, correct? Or at least is commonly understood.
Yeah.
This says, how does Arjuna's position make sense of the reality of evil or its non-reality in the world? Isn't there a different ontology? Like, I know some schools say evil is just ignorance and it's not an actual ontological reality in and of itself. Is that true? That's the common understanding.
Yeah, we don't have an ontological category for evil. We would say, evil. We're happy with the idea evil is the absence of God. So we do have. It would appear like the devil as depicted in Christianity seems to match up with Shiva. I haven't studied this, and I really don't know how well that kind of works. I've not really made any effort to syncretize Krishna consciousness with other ontologies, but yeah, we don't have an idea of evil, and I find the idea that there's like this rogue devil guy who is really causing a lot of trouble, and God's got his hands tied. He's helpless to stop him. I find that kind of incoherent, because if God's all powerful, how could he have his hands tied? Like, why can't he stop this guy?
Oh no! So you've listened to that atheist argument one too many times. So you read the Book of Job and go, "That doesn't make any sense."
It doesn't make any sense.
Isn't there a devil in some iterations of Hinduism?
So we have this idea of Maya. So actually, Shiva's wife is Durga Devi, and she has the service of overseeing the material energy. And so when we turn our backs on God, we enter this material world, and her job is to cover us over and to give us suffering. But there's a purpose for that. It's because we have these rebellious desires. So in order to satisfy them, like if let's say, some business has a monopoly, and it's like, They just make the other person's product suck. It's like, well, you can buy our product, which is great, or you can buy that crappy product. Which product are you going to buy? It's like, that's not a choice. Like, you're just monopolizing. So if we want to choose to turn away from God, there has to be an option. Otherwise, there's no free will. If it's just like, well, we're having a party here and you can go sit in that cave if you want. You know,
that's not actually all that.
That's not free will.
That different, right? But that's not all that different from some theological understandings of the devil. I mean, that's very similar to tempter and like trying to.
But we see
there's some people who would argue that in Christian terms, the exact same. This is what I was trying to say when you were with Aaron Ra, because almost everything you said to him, I could think of a Christian version of the exact same idea, and it was easy for me to do that when I was just listening to you. And he wasn't even trying to understand step one of what you meant. You know, he was just kind of like, okay, is it my turn to debunk? It's my turn. Okay, I debunk, dismiss, discredit. You know, it's like, oh, the conversation goes to me. Okay, here's why you're wrong. And he didn't even like make, but everything you said had a parallel. Like that has a parallel in some theological understandings of Christianity. But I cut you off. Go ahead.
Right. Well, that fits with our understanding of other religions, which is that we, you know, like when a prophet comes down, I'm probably changing the subject, but anyway, we can get back on track. When a prophet comes down, you know, God comes personally or sends somebody, they have a particular caliber of people who they're reaching out to. So, you know, if a math professor is teaching math to 5-year-olds, they're going to give a different caliber of teaching than if they're teaching math to PhD students. So when Jesus came, he was basically teaching farmers and peasants and so on. And when Muhammad was giving teachings, he was teaching, you know, the people that were in the area at the time, and it wasn't the most sophisticated society ever in that region at that time. Whereas when Lord Chaitanya came, who came 500 years ago, he had some of his core disciples, the 6 Goswamis. Jiva Goswami and Rupa Goswami are considered intellectual giants of their time, even by secular scholars of Indian history. They wrote immense literature, so that they got these teachings from Lord Chaitanya directly, and then wrote tons of books. And before they got those teachings from Lord Chaitanya, they were erudite and knew, you know, all the different the different Indian philosophies inside out, especially Jiva Goswami. Right. So that, you know, so this, we have this idea, which, yeah, I mean, I hadn't really heard a good explanation of the devil. If it fits with our understanding, then it becomes coherent. So I think we have a more comprehensive and clear explanation of it. So Durga Devi is given the service of distracting us, and it's like, you know, it's almost like testing us. It's like, if, you know, like God wants us to come back to him, but it's like the process of different things is sort of compartmentalized. So, you know, there's God who's, you know, it's like good cop, bad cop kind of thing. It's but on a cosmic level and done with a lot more nuance. So there's like the material energy, which punishes you if you're an idiot. And even if you're God conscious and you do everything right, the material world is still here to, it gives pure devotees a hard time in order to glorify the pure devotee. Because when you see a pure devotee, you know, and go through so much difficulty and they rise above it, and then it shows their character, and it's like an ornament on their exalted character to see how they behave in those situations. And it can help remind the devotee of our need to take shelter of God. And it's a different, also, you know, by seeing God and everything, we can see the suffering and the tragedy of life. We can find a way to see God in it. And so Durga Devi, or Mahamaya, has the service of testing us. So, you know, we say we want to turn to God, and then it's like, well, what about this? You know, would you like to enjoy these things? It's like, oh yeah, I'll take some of that. It's like, well, then you're not that serious about turning to God, are you?
Right, gotcha. So it's like temptation and distraction. There are similar concepts, definitely. Like, yeah, everything can be translated. How do you process other? Do you have an explanation where you brought up other religious texts? Is there sort of like a official what other religions are about in your scriptures? Official position?
I mentioned there's that scripture which we see as questionable, which talks about Jesus and Christianity, but it could have been interpolated. But in Bhagavatam itself, there is a mention of Buddha coming to bewilder the atheists and Shankaracharya coming later. So Buddha came at a time when people had the Vedas, but they weren't following it properly. So I mean, it's quite mystical, but there's, the Brahmanas had quite mystical abilities, and they could do a fire sacrifice. The horse would go into the fire and come out with a new body. And it had a ritualistic function, but it was also a way of testing their mantras. So if you do that and the horse comes out with a new body, then your mantra's working.
Right.
But at the time when Buddha came, they were doing it and just killing animals. They weren't doing it properly. They weren't getting the result. They were just killing animals. And maybe there was meat eating too. And Buddha came along and just said, forget the Vedas, throw all of that out. You're suffering. There's a way to stop suffering. Here's how you stop suffering. That's basically his teachings. He didn't give an ontology. He said, describe the absolute truth by telling you what it's not. So we are in our tradition, it's actually said that Buddha is actually an incarnation of Krishna, of God, who came to bewilder the atheists. So it's pretty funny, all these atheists, they've got a statue of Buddha which they pray to and worship.
I remember when you brought this up with Aaron, and he freaked out because he told you this story about how he has Buddhist friends, and he went to a Buddhist wedding, and he's like, they're atheists, so I'm down with them. And then one of them starts giving him a cosmology or something, and he gets like, he starts breaking out into hives. Like, you actually believe in angels and demons, and like some sort of like rant where it's bizarre. It's like certain types of things just get him like foaming at the mouth. Like, he was totally cool with Buddhism as long as it's atheist and there's no supreme being. And then he's in league with it to a certain point. But then when he had Buddhist friends who, like, you find that in actual Buddhism, that people, start believing things that other people and other faiths believe just sort of automatically, like believe in angels and demons and, even though they're technically Buddhists and they don't. That's something that people should actually look into, because that would be a really interesting thing to study, where people just sort of organically start believing in stuff that they weren't taught by their religion. They just sort of, start adopting it on a folk level. But he started getting really offended by that. Like, they believe in, you guys believe in God and demons and angels?
They make this silly argument that it's like, we just go one God further. So it's like, the Christians came along and they rejected all this pantheism stuff and, animism and stuff. And they just, have God. And then we go and that's a progression, right? Because you went from, anthropomorphizing everything in nature to just putting it all in one place and having God. And then we go a step further and we just do away with God. It's like, which is a really dumb argument, because, going from pantheism to theism, it's kind of like you're just taking that sort of mysticism and putting it all in one place. But going from theism to atheism is like, like I like David Wood's argument, when you go from sense to nonsense, he gave the podium builder analogy. When you say nobody built the podium, that's when you enter the realm of nonsense.
Right. And a lot of those talking points are just like clever. They're just too clever, and nobody ever thinks them through. So they say, like, you don't believe in Thor, so I don't believe in God. Let's just go one step further. That's what they're kind of like.
I did a video. Sorry. I did a video debunking that, where it's like Michael Shermer loves that argument. It's the way I framed it was to turn it on its head. It's like, well, actually, all these religions agree that they reject natural science as being the only means of acquiring knowledge. That they don't give primacy to materialistic means of acquiring knowledge. That they think that we can intuitively connect with God and intuitively understand when we read a scripture, there's some truth to it. They reject absolute materialism and hold that matter isn't all that exists. There is a metaphysical layer to reality. Like you get reincarnation, or the idea
that's what I was saying. That's the first thing you started saying to Aaron Ra. You said there.
He didn't let me read my list. I was planning on reading this list. Sorry.
Yeah, but do you have the list? Because you can read it.
Yeah, so that's two of them. I got two more. Yeah, they all teach that an eternal state or destination is the highest goal of life and is attained by availing oneself of revealed knowledge. And they all teach that our existence extends beyond the death of the body. So that's four things where even Buddhism agrees. You get some Buddhists disagree, but most people who have any kind of metaphysical belief will agree with those four things. So you take Michael Shermer's argument that, like, what are the chances that these few Christians happen to be right and everyone else is wrong? It's like, well, what are the chances are that everybody who has a spiritual worldview is wrong on these things? Because they all agree on this. So what are the chances that all of them who agree on this are wrong, and you atheists who are only few in number in recent years are the ones that are right?
And if you actually examine your own beliefs carefully, probably don't necessarily believe them all that deeply. You've had experiences that you've rationalized away. That's why Aaron Ross starts getting, that's at least one possible explanation why it gets so uptight, because what you just explained is basically every religious person in a nutshell. So let's go over it slowly, just so we get it clearly. What was the first one?
I'll put it in the chat. That might help. I wonder if it'll probably lose all the formatting in the chat. It's too long. 500. I'll have to do them one by one. So the first one is that they reject science being the gatekeepers of knowledge. It's like, this idea that science is like, like
the only thing that can tell us what's what. It's like personal revelation. Is that the second one, or is this tied to the second one? Because personal revelation is something that every faith believes is a valid way to understanding the world. Like in Christianity, the Holy Spirit can give you revelation. In Hinduism, revelation can come from other sources than just, there's other ways of seeking truth. Right? Rejecting, I see, you put in rejecting natural science.
Yeah, that would fit under that one. I didn't specifically give an alternative epistemology. I mean, giving another epistemology is a lot of work, especially if you want to build it up in a robust way.
Right, but the reason why I thought this was interesting is that's definitely worth doing, because there is a through line between all these different types of worldviews, and the only person excluded is the atheist. And what your four things is pretty close to everybody else.
Yeah.
It's
so
like
the way they make that,
I don't know if you know. Go ahead.
Sorry, you go. Okay, the way they make the argument is we got a delay. They make the conflation of conflicts fallacy, which is to say that because there's disagreement, they must all be wrong. It's like, okay, well, let's try applying that to science. Like, there's 50 different theories of the Big Bang. Does that mean the Big Bang theories, all 50 of them are wrong? Or and they use it to discredit the entire field of religion. Like, oh, well, they all disagree, so the whole field must be invalid. It's like, okay, well, astrophysicists all disagree. So does that mean that astrophysics is completely invalid? I don't think so.
But what you actually found was that there's essentials that they do all agree on. It's just the details that they will conflict over. So like how Joseph Campbell explained it is they all agree that there is a hidden, unseen, immaterial world that interacts with and undergirds the material world. And that's all of them in a nutshell. And the only people who disagree with that are atheists or naturalists. They don't think there's a hidden.
That sounds good. Hidden, unseen,
immaterial world that undergirds and interacts with the known material world.
That's nice.
That's all of them in a nutshell. And that's the only people who don't believe that are pure naturalists. And are you into quantum physics, or you guys had an argument on
a little
consciousness?
bit? Yeah. So, we had a debate on that, and Josh Wolf, who was on our side, argued based on quantum physics. Yeah. So it fits perfectly with our ontology, which holds that the material world is basically a simulation. So we see it's described as not real, but what's meant by that, if you hermeneutically analyze the Sanskrit, is that it's temporary. So anything that is eternal is considered real, and anything that's temporary is considered not real. It's like you play a video game and you're in it for some time, and at some point you're out. It doesn't mean we shouldn't, raise our kids nicely and feed the homeless and so on. It just means that we should correctly understand that this is temporary. So if you raise your kids well and feed the homeless, they're still going to take birth again. What we need to do is work on elevating their consciousness, because if you elevate somebody's consciousness, you've worked on something eternal, and that elevation of consciousness becomes their eternal asset.
Right, but there's an actual argument from physics that floats around where it's not quite proving some of what you're saying, but it's getting close to it. Where I forget his name, but have you heard the physicist who talks about he was just on Robert Wright. I just watched a little bit of his thing where he actually is asserting through physics that we're in a simulation. Like it's an actual argument about the world.
Oh, it's something Hoffman or something. Yeah.
Yes, Hoffman. That's his name. I'm not saying he's right, but there are interesting things in there that actually parallel Well, you're more of a monotheist, even though you're a Hindu, right? I mean, you call yourself a monotheist, or no?
Well, I mean, we accept that there's like Shiva and Ganesh and all these far out personalities, but we see them the way you might see angels. So they're empowered. Like they're not ordinary people. Some of those posts, a regular Jiva soul like us can reach those posts, and some of them are like eternal ontological categories that personality always exists as that personality. Okay. But yeah, we see them as like, it's like there was a good way of explaining it is there was a German scholar who went to India and he was looking at all the different, church temples and beliefs and different personalities that were getting worshipped. He was trying to figure out which one of them's God. And he arrived at the conclusion that Krishna must be God because everybody else is working and Krishna's enjoying.
He's laying back and telling them what to do. There you go.
So, like, you go to a factory, and if you see everyone working hard, and you find one person who's playing mini golf, it's like this person's the boss.
Right. Totally.
Yeah. I mean,
it's funny because there was this is only vaguely related, but you made me think of in The Godfather. There was Marlon Brando's performance, and part of there was Pauline Kael was analyzing why it's so brilliant, and he's one of the first actors who intuitively understood if you have all this power, you're casual and soft-spoken. Most people try to play it like you're this hardcore badass, and he kind of played it like I talk very softly. Like he totally understood how power actually works. That's kind of what you just said, right? Like true power is going to be the soft-spoken, quiet person in the corner who nobody's going to cross because they're afraid of. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, well, that's kind of it. I mean, every now and again, one of the demigods would get a bit puffed up. And right,
and then it gets smacked down by the true power, right?
But Krishna would do it in a really elegant way. We have this idea. It's something like Zeus that there's a person there's people in charge of everything. So every aspect of the material creation is engineered. It's like a plant, and there's people operating all of it. So there's someone in charge of the weather. There's someone in charge of the wind, and so on. So Indra, who's the king of the demigods, got puffed up and thought that. They got angry with Krishna because Krishna diverted his worship and got them to worship Govardhan Hill, which was it's all quite mystical, another form of Krishna. And so he started attacking this village with thunderstorms and rain. And Krishna went and picked up the hill, made the hill into an umbrella, and they all came in under the umbrella. And Indra just went nuts with the most furious storm he possibly could muster. Throwing down sleets like hail and sleets and thunder. And they're just chilling out under this hill, and Krishna's having an intimate time with all his devotees. It's like a loving pastime. And then when he's exhausted after 7 days, he stops the storm. They all come out, and Krishna goes and apologizes to him in private. Or there was another time where Lord Brahma thought, how everyone's saying that this little boy living in this village is God. How can that be? I'm going to play a trick on him. So he went and took all his cows, and the Krishna and his friends would go and herd the cowherd boys in the village. He went and took all his cows and friends away, and he was just there in the fords all by himself. And the time is different. So for the time for Brahma, 1 second, 1 minute for him takes a year here. So he's just gone 1 minute. I thought, I better go and check what's happening. But in that, Krishna thought, I don't want anyone to miss the cows or friends. So he just manifested himself as identical boys and cows, and then went home, and everyone got to have loving exchanges directly with Krishna. And then when Lord Brahma came back, he saw the boys there, and then he saw the same boys in the cave, and you never find anything identical in the material world. Nothing is identical. So Lord Brahma, who's the empowered creator of the material world, was totally astounded to see there's two boys here, and these boys here are identical. How could this possibly be? He was stunned, and then the boys turned into Vishnu forms, and then he figured out that this is actually God. And so he played that. It's just a clever way of playing a trick. He just innocently did it. So that was two pastimes you made me think of when you said how power is done in a subdued. It's soft, underspoken
power. Yeah. So it was like sleight of hand in that instant. The debate you just had on your channel was Aaron Ra and what was that guy's name?
Josh Wolf. I've got one with Matt Dillahunty coming up.
With who? You and Matt Dillahunty?
No. I've got a Hare Krishna intellectual. So a lot of the arguments I give, I've borrowed from Hridayananda Goswami, who's also known as Dr. Howard Resnick. He's got a PhD from Harvard University in Sanskrit and Indian studies, and he's really good at philosophy. So he'll be having a discussion with Matt Dillahunty in a couple of weeks on my channel on epistemology. So basically, this argument I give from self-evidence.
Yeah, that sounds fantastic. Is it going to be a debate or is it just a discussion? It's going to be
it'll be like a debate discussion. So the format will be conversational.
Oh man, I can't wait for that. When is that? In 2 weeks?
Yeah, we're finalizing the date, but it's looking like it'll be September 25th or 26th at what is it, your time? That would be like 3 p.m. Your time.
Does Dillahunty debate? I've never seen them if they're out there. People like Hindus like yourself or comparative.
I'm not aware of him ever debating any Hindus. I started this YouTube channel because I saw that, I'm passionate about apologetics, and I saw all this, a lack of the Hare Krishna perspective on the apologetic scene. So I was like, I got to do something about this. So I'm very happy to be creating this opportunity for this guy, Hridayananda Goswami. He's our best debater. He's like, he debates inside the movement and people are terrified of him. And then he's not really had debates outside the movement. So I'm really excited.
You're kidding? The guy who's going to debate Matt Dillahunty?
Yeah. He's totally expert. If on my channel, you'll find a video called the Hare Krishna Brainwashing Debate. It's the same guy. That guy with the square glasses.
Let me write that down. I got to check this. Oh man, this is so fun. So do you think he's gonna kill Matt Dillahunty? Is that what you're saying? Are you predicting? You got to downplay expectations. That's how you do it in politics.
You know how these things go. That the skeptic will never admit defeat. They'll just. I mean, I'm hopeful. Hridayananda Goswami declined to debate Aaron Ra. He said, "No, I'm not talking to that guy."
Yeah, that's probably wise. Because Aaron Ra isn't going to engage with the arguments. He's just going to try to make you look stupid. Matt Dillahunty is going to legitimately engage with the arguments because he knows he will look stupid if he doesn't. So he will engage properly. So he could actually be defeated by somebody. Aaron Ra can't. He'll just like bulldoze you with his, his persona.
I mean, I'm skeptical. People always ask me, like, who won the debate? It's like, nobody wins these debates. The audience may have been convinced one way or the other, but I mean, with Matt Dillahunty, he will, if somebody makes a good point, he will accept that it's a good point. But I really can't see Matt Dillahunty ever coming to the point where he accepts that that it's hypothetically possible that some people know God exists because God's revealed himself to them. He'll just say.
He said here's what he's actually said in a debate, and this is sort of that. He said, if I had a Damascus Road experience, then it would be perhaps, he did say perhaps, it would be rationally justified for me to believe in that experience, but nobody outside of myself is justified in believing me, which I totally agree with. I agree with everything.
Well, I agree with that too. But if you find a group, like, say we like to call it a spiritual science, and defining science here as a reliable means of acquiring knowledge and producing results. So if we have a spiritual science which is capable of reliably transforming people's consciousness, where they turn around saying, I know this is true, I've experienced it, then maybe it's also rational to give it a shot. Yeah,
well, that totally makes sense, but that's not what the guy's going to be arguing for.
Someone gave me an ice.
That's a normal thought process, and that's where Christians have to be, like, if applied to Christianity, where we have to be convincing. Like we say, I was Mr. Cocaine Sex, and now I'm a Christian, and Jesus transformed my life. And if we're convincing about that, then someone will go, my life is terrible too. Maybe I'll give it a shot. So that makes sense as a try this argument. What have you got to lose? But that's not necessarily makes sense as a rational justification where an atheist, for evidence-based conclusion outside of ourselves. You know what I mean? I didn't say that very well, but I think you know what I mean.
Well, I was having a debate on Facebook the other day, and somebody mentioned how they've had actually, it was in a messenger group. They had eye surgery, and now they can see 20/20. And that eye surgery has a 99.7% success rate or something. So there's evidence behind it. It's like, yeah, but using the typical skeptical argument, or Aaron Ra's point, Yeah, but those people having their eyesight restored only counts as evidence to the people who've had their eyesight restored. It shouldn't count as evidence for you unless you personally get your eyesight restored.
Right.
But I mean, that's not a good argument. I mean, if the thing has a 99.7% success rate, like you analyze statistically, like if you take somebody who's had that surgery and it didn't work for them, what are the chances that it just didn't work for that person because they're the 0.3%? And what are the chances that the surgery is totally bogus?
Right. But see, the problem with the atheists is there are very few atheists who even put themselves in the position of what you're saying enough to understand that particular type of point. So did you look into Planetary and Reformed Epistemology? Do you know anything about that? Because it's similar arguments. You should check it out. Part of the idea is there's a thing called the sensus divinatus, which is a sense of God. And religious people actually are experiencing ontologically a sense of God. And that is justification for itself. They have a rational justification to believe what they believe unless some big defeater arrives. So it's very similar to what you said. And I've always made it analogous to like a headache. You don't need evidence for your headache. You experience the headache. It's evidence of itself, right? You see what I'm saying?
That's a good example. I'm liking this eyesight example because if somebody's had their eyesight restored, we can verify that. We can get them to do a reading test, and if they can read the numbers, then we know that their eyesight's been restored. It's like, okay, well, if somebody's had an experience of God and their attitude has completely changed, they made a 360-degree turnaround in their lifestyle. They're happy. They're mental, like people who come to Krishna Consciousness with mental illness, even like their mental illness doesn't get cured. Maybe it does sometimes, but they'll often struggle for a few years and eventually they'll kind of come to a more functional platform and then it become steady. Like there's many examples of that where someone had terrible mental illness, took shelter of Krishna Consciousness, struggled for years, and eventually they sort of stabilized. They're still living with mental illness, but they're much better than they were before.
Right. Well, that's part of the thing of like my brother-in-law and my sister became Christians automatically when they saw me because they were so struck by the transformation in me. Now, that is evidence, and that is evidence that can be empirically verified if you have the tools to, like, it's very similar to your eye analogy. Yeah, you can do a test. Now the person can see. So you can do a before and after on a religious experience and see that there is some sort of, it's not a hypothetical transformational power. It's a real transformational power, right? I mean, there's a way of verifying if it's really occurring. Correct?
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm going to do a video. I might do a video on this one. I'm just...
You should. What was the thing you said about science? You used the science is. I liked your definition of science. Is that a technical definition? Or is that just
no? I just made that up. Science is a reliable means of acquiring knowledge and producing results.
Yeah, but I like that. That kind of works.
And
is an atheist going to bust my chops if I use that?
Well, I don't know what you think about the Discovery Institute and Stephen Meyer and all their work on the theory of evolution, or work against the theory of evolution. But they point out that, like in the Dover trial, where they ruled that intelligent design shouldn't get taught in schools, they basically ruled it out by definition because they defined science in such a way that it rules out intelligent design, because they said, it's all about looking for natural causes for everything. It's like, well, that doesn't tell us anything about reality. That tells us something about you putting a boundary on what you're prepared to accept as knowledge. Right.
Well, you got to always be careful with secular people's sleight of hand, because they do that. They did that with the Jesus stuff. There was a where they were deciding what Jesus actually said and what he didn't, and they automatically ruled out anything that had to do with supernatural. So the presupposition is like baked into the cake. He didn't say this. Why? Because he's talking about something we don't believe. So therefore he didn't say, okay, that doesn't work like that. So that's always at play with secular people, where they're trying to smuggle in, an inauthentic skepticism. Matt Dillahunty, I think, has an authentic skepticism. In other words, if your homeboy legitimately bests him in the argument and legitimately makes points that are sound and reasonable, and we in the audience go, yes, that's correct, he will yield. I've seen him do it. So he might. Yeah, this might be a really interesting.
I was so funny. I went into the Atheists Experience Facebook group trying to figure out how to get a hold of him, and they like dogpiled on me. It's like, just trying to organize a
What
debate.
would they
what's
do?
the-
No way.
Someone was criticizing me for trying to become an influencer. It's like my response to them is, I bet you're not trying to do anything or start anything. He's like, yeah, that's right. It's like, yeah. So why say something to somebody who's trying to do something? Like, anyway, it's funny. But then I finally got a hold of Matt Dillahunty, and he's like really respectful, like, replying and, saying, oh, I'm busy for the next few months. I replied to him, a few months later, and he's like, oh, yeah, we can fit this in, and so, and we're still finalizing the date. And he's like really respectful.
Yeah, he's normally pretty cool. It's only on the Atheist Experience where he acts awful, because he beats up on someone and hangs up on him and beats up, and it's like he's got a shtick. If you should no, definitely not, because you'll see the other side of him. Right. There is a place where you can have a cool, reasonable conversation with him, but that's probably not the forum.
I'm looking forward to this discussion.
You know who you should call? Truth Wanted, my boy Objectively Dan. You can watch my interview with him, and I've actually guest hosted. That's an offshoot of the ACA, the Atheist Experience group. That's a lot more mellow and conversational, and he'll give you a fair hearing. He's a really good guy. Cool. And I guest hosted once.
Tom Jump has invited me on his channel. That's happening next week.
Oh, that should be cool. I'll watch that. Tom Jump can sometimes be. I was on his channel. It was fine. You should check that out.
I haven't gone through and listened to lots of the stuff. I was going to do that next week so I can prepare. I was listening to Aaron. Sorry.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. You go. Sometimes Tom Jump is, when he's in a debate, he can be like kind of annoying in a debate mode. But when I was on his channel, he gave me a totally fair hearing. It was totally cool.
Oh, cool. This sounds good. I remember listening to Aaron Ra when I was preparing for my discussion with him, and it was painful.
Yeah, no, I've never seen him give a fair hearing to anybody. I don't think.
Well, but when he's making his arguments, he just gives like assertion after assertion after assertion, and then when he does give evidence for something, it's a non sequitur.
Right. He goes in a sledgehammer like manhandle mode, and he sledgehammers and manhandles. He listens to you enough to get an idea of how he's going to attack you, and then he sledgehammers and manhandles you for the rest of the time. That's really
even just his speeches that he gives to atheist audiences, it's like assertion after assertion after assertion, and then evidence which doesn't support his conclusions. It's like the evidence that consciousness is produced by the brain, or the evidence is that when you tinker with the brain, it messes with consciousness. It's like, all right.
And they never listen to the counter argument.
I've got a light on my desk right now, and like I can tinker with it by messing with the thing I've got in front of it. Like, look, it's changing the light that's on me. Just because I'm moving my arm around, does that mean my arm is producing the light?
Right. And then when somebody makes an analogy that totally shows why that's a fault, why they're wrong, they deliberately misunderstand the analogy. Like one analogy that this guy, Eric Hernandez, made makes perfect sense. Or actually the one that Braxton Hunter made is the best one. You have a radio. There's FM station playing out of your radio. That's consciousness. You break your radio, it can't play the FM station. It doesn't mean they're the same thing.
Yeah. Well, I'm on this call right now, right? And you can see me through the camera. Like, if the power goes off, I'll drop out of this call. Does that mean I've stopped existing? Does that mean that the power was producing me?
Right, but they misunderstand it so completely that I've heard people make that analogy in support of their conclusion. Like, I'm on the internet right now, and I'm like, dude, you just said what we're trying to explain to you, you dumb. Like, there's like a block. Because somewhere inside Aaron Ra, I think he recognizes that if he accepts that there's an immaterial realm to life at all, then you got to account for. Then the next step is, how do you account for it without any type of spirituality? That becomes well nigh impossible. Right?
What I've been realizing more and more is that these atheists rule out God's existence and any kind of metaphysical thing by definition. It's like victory by definition. And like my next video I'm working on now is against the God of the gaps argument. What I figured out is that they basically make their argument by definition. It's like any argument that has God as a conclusion is a God of the gaps argument. It's like, can we just do that with anything? Like any argument that has gravity as a conclusion is a gravity of the gaps argument. Like,
right.
Totally. It gets silly fast. Yeah.
Like, the God of the gaps argument is also like ludicrous, because if the God that we're positing exists, then he is by definition the explanation. the God of the gaps in all situations. We're talking about, the sovereign creator of heaven and earth, which means if you say like, well, how does evolution work? God would be the answer, exactly as God ordained it to work. It's they just don't think it through in a way that they can. I don't know. It's weird sometimes how much they don't process it. Like,
Well,
there's a way. Go ahead.
They base their God of the Gaps argument on really bad epistemology, like just bad philosophy. Like, there's a pandemic in the world today caused by scientists never needing, epidemic, I should say, never needing to take a single philosophy paper. You can get a PhD without taking one philosophy paper. And these scientists go on to make philosophical claims about reality without having any training in philosophy. So like Neil deGrasse Tyson in one video, he's like, if that's where you're going to put your God, then it's an ever receding realm of scientific ignorance. It's like, but you have no idea that the explanations scientists give are themselves a form of evidence for God. Like, the laws of physics are a really good example. You give the fine-tuning argument, but Stephen Ambar in one of his books made a good point about symmetry. So, if you take marbles and, anyway, you put them in a glass dish, they'll all sink to the bottom. They'll make a symmetrical pattern. And it can, you can take a photo of it. It could be quite artistic. It's like, so that's called symmetry. Any way you manipulate the marble is the same. You could, anytime you shake the marbles up, they'll make that same shape in the bowl. That's symmetry. So we have that in the laws of physics. And that symmetry in the laws of physics makes the planets orbit. It makes atoms form. And so for the marbles, how do you explain that all the marbles are the same size and round? It's like, by saying that, the marbles have symmetry, that explains how they make this pattern. It's like, okay, but now you have to explain why the marbles have that symmetry, and then you wind up at the marble factory. So when we find the symmetry in the laws of physics, and you say, we've proven that we don't need God because the laws of physics can produce all this stuff, it's like,
it's inane. It's like you're deliberately trying to read this in a way that rules out an ontology that it doesn't authentically rule out. They're trying to find a defeater inauthentically. That's to say, they do the same thing with if you had a spiritual experience and it could be mapped in the brain, then it's only the brain. But it doesn't work like that. It's like you're ruling out the supernatural inauthentically. You're basically what you said, by definition, ruling it out of existence, and then saying these things all prove it out of existence when they don't. They're inauthentic defeaters, right?
Yeah. What was that? Inspiring Philosophy put out a good video on the God of the Gaps where he made this point. Is like, really what they're doing is they're revealing their worldview when they say that you can't use that as a hypothesis. Because, if you have reason for a conclusion and you just say, but that conclusion, if you put that conclusion in the argument, that's a logical fallacy, all you're saying is you're just rejecting that conclusion a priori.
Yeah. So you watch IP's videos?
Yeah. Not incessantly. I've watched a lot of Capturing Christianity. I like his stuff.
So you watch his debates. The debates he has are really good, and the interviews. Most of his stuff is really good. Who do people you like in the Christian community, like philosophers that you're interested in? Anyone or people making arguments?
I'm going to get the milk. I got the phone at 01.
Okay. All right. So like another half hour.
Daddy, and I made stuff. Daddy,
anyway,
I made stuff.
I'm gonna have to get going soon.
We'll do about 15 more minutes.
Christian philosophers that I like. William Lane Craig is hands down the best defender of theism in a debate setting there is, and then of course there's philosophers he quotes like Alvin Plantinga and stuff that do great work. Heaps of the stuff on Capturing Christianity's channel I really like. He's got lots of good discussions on there. Inspiring Philosophy does some good stuff. He had a nice debate with Cosmic Skeptic.
I watched that. That was the Problem of Evil debate. I saw that.
That was a good debate.
I think I did a video on that. I might have done a video on it. Who's the guy? Who's the guy who's debating Matt Dillon? Before I forget. And you're put.
Well, he in Krishna Consciousness, in the Hare Krishna movement, we know him as Hridayananda Goswami, which is a bit of a mouthful, but his academic, his Western name is Howard Resnick. I've put a link in the chat to the video on my channel where he's debating Ted Patrick. It's funny. The reason why my channel has so many subscribers is because in 2015, I noticed that brainwashing debate video wasn't on YouTube. So I put it on YouTube. And then like a couple of years later, I looked, I was like, wow, I've got 900 subscribers. And then one day I was like, geez, I need to like get Krishna consciousness on the map and the apologetic scene. So I took advantage of the channel, which was up to 1,800 subscribers by then, just because I hosted that video.
Wow, that's weird. So
It's
one
had
video, how many views did that-
380,000 views.
Damn. So we got to get a video to go viral. What was the secret sauce in that video?
It's the Ted Patrick, who's the famous deprogrammer from the 80s, who spent more time in jail than out of jail because of his subversive deprogramming tactics. I mean, he's glorified as a hero because he did save a lot of kids from genuine cults. But his work on the Hare Krishnas was silly. They just like kidnap these kids, like just turn up, kidnap them. The parents would be in the car behind them, take them away somewhere, and then use all these like psychological techniques to try to brainwash them out of being a Hare Krishna. And like if somebody's in a cult, like cults, some of those cults were dangerous. It's a good thing to get them out. But with Krishna consciousness, we're like a bona fide religion going back thousands of years. Like we run a court case just by showing them all our books, and that court case in America set an international precedent for religious rights.
So he was saying that it's a cult. Is that part of what the debate is about?
The Hare Krishna brainwashing debate. So Ted Patrick was arguing that us Hare Krishnas are all brainwashed. You know, when we chant Hare Krishna, we mumble the names of God over and over again. That stops us from thinking.
Oh, God. That's what the debate is about? Is that the 380,000 views? Or is this just...
Yeah, that's it. It's a 30-minute thing. It's off a TV show. And Hridayana Goswami and another Hare Krishna were on this TV show debating if the Krishna consciousness movement is a cult that brainwashes its members or if it's a genuine religious process.
Now, are there videos, if I put Howard Resnick into YouTube search, are there videos, there are other debates of him on epistemology?
He hasn't, I mean, I could find a presentation he gave where he talks about epistemology. I'll warn you, it's not very charitable to Christianity. He gives a bit of history of
but neither is Aaron Ra, and neither is half the stuff I watch, so I can take it.
Well, I mean, my personal view is that the criticisms of aspects of Christianity coming from a fellow theist can be harder to deal with than coming from an atheist. Because with the atheist, they might have part of their argument might be valid, but then they push a conclusion that doesn't follow. So it's pretty easy to be like, this is a ridiculous argument. But when you come up to someone who's just saying, you know, like, how can God be exclusive? You know, how can God be all loving? And simultaneously, if you're a Hare Krishna and you dedicate your whole life to loving him, you're still going to hell because you filled in the form wrong. You know, you made a minor theological mistake, so you're going to hell despite all your good works and thinking you were dedicating your life to God. That's not compatible with an all-loving God, you know. So that's a harder argument to respond to than saying, oh, well, see, look, you've got this Christian exclusivism. So, you know, what are the chances that you're right and everyone else is wrong? More likely, everyone else is wrong. It's like,
right. Well, no, I mean, Christian exclusivism like that, I can understand why somebody, but that's not necessarily. There are a lot of Christians who don't hold to that particular idea of Christianity. Right. So
I've got a debate coming up with the same guy, with Hridayana Goswami, where he'll be debating Seth Hart, who's a PhD student, Christian, on is Christ the only way to salvation. So Seth Hart's view is someone could have a genuine relationship with God and be a member of another religion. Someone could be a member of another religion or have nothing to do with the Christian organizations, but Jesus could come to them in their heart and they could have a connection with Jesus and go back to God and, you know, go to heaven or whatever. Right. So that's his view. So we're going to argue that, well, you don't need Jesus. You can go back with other saints too.
How I've argued it in actual debates, you'd probably agree with. So, for example, the Apostle Paul, the Bible says God is no respecter of persons. And the Apostle Paul was on his way to kill Christians, which is about as bad a thing as you could be doing. And God just intervened and sovereignly showed up and said, I am God. And if God is no respecter of persons, and there's no reason to assume, even if technically you are headed for the fire if you don't accept Jesus, there's no reason to assume that he wouldn't do that for other people who are operating in ignorance. You know, that's common sense. If your view of God's justice belies just common sense, there's something you're probably not right about. right?
Well, William Lane Craig and a lot of other Christian apologists, they defend Christian exclusivism.
Yeah, I'm sure I would probably not agree with, or I doubt I'd agree with him. I might, but I might not. All I'm saying is that it's only if you frame it in a way that's irreconcilable that it's irreconcilable. If you lose the framing that's irreconcilable, you can reconcile it 5 or 10 different ways. You see what I mean? Yes, no?
Yeah. Oh, well, that's kind of a meta point. I'm not sure exactly how it ties in.
No, I don't know why. I don't even know how it came up. Actually, that's we were just talking,
you were talking about
it. And you said don't watch him because he's going to say something that's going to trigger you.
I was just warning you. Yeah, I was just warning you. He's not very charitable to Christians. And then you said, "Oh, it's fine. I'm used to it." And I said that I think it's a little bit more, a little bit harder to deal with coming from a fellow theist.
Right. This one you won't be able to take. You can shrug off the atheist.
Well, I'm not saying you won't be able to take it. I'm just warning you that it's not charitable. Right. I mean, I'm all for having a sense of brotherhood among different religions. So, when somebody says inflammatory things about another religion, I'll discourage someone of that religion from following it. But he's just being scholarly. He's not saying things that aren't true. He's talking about the history of the violence that early Christians did and so on.
Right. No, I get it. I understand. So I'm really looking forward to that, though. I'll send you a link. Yeah, I'm excited, and the Christian one should be good too. I mean, I'd love to get a debate like that with William Lane Craig or something like that, but I don't think he'll agree to engage with it. Although maybe with Matt Dillahunty engaging, we'll get some notoriety and be able to get some attention from some of these other guys. Yeah, absolutely. If he does well, forget it. Is that going to be on your channel when it happens? Yeah, it'll be on my channel. That could be a big boost for a channel right there. You could get into like the 2500s. Because Matt Dillahunty's going to post it on his channel too. Most of the views will go to his channel, but I'll have it on my channel for the first 2 weeks. Exclusively. When you have a big channel and they post your video, it actually sends people towards your channel. It's good. When people don't do it, it's nowhere near as good. Like when I interviewed the genetically modified skeptic twice. You mentioned him, didn't you? Have you got a hold of him? I'd love to get a hold of that guy. He seems like a nice guy. Yeah, I could tell him you're interested. I was doing a video that includes him in it. That's got clips from him. I haven't done it yet. That was the one I parked because it was just too technical, too long, and too dry. But I'm better at figuring out how to make things engaging now. So I'll make that video and then I'll follow up with you and get in touch, see if I can get in touch with that guy. Yeah. But the first time I had him on my channel, he posted it on his channel, and it made that particular video has something like 5,000 views, which was way more than I got in any other video because he posted it. Right. So if Matt Dillahunty posts it, you will get more views because of that. You'll get like 1,000 extra views or so. Because Matt Dillahunty's well, the better thing would be if he shared it with his audience, but gave them the link to my hosting and said, "Go subscribe to this guy because he's awesome." Butter him up. Do your little Hindu charm work. Do your what do Hindus do when they're trying to win somebody over? Do one of those. Josh Wolf was really good with Aaron Ra. He was really charming. That Aaron Ra really worked on the beginning because he was much better in his beginning with Josh Wolf than he had been with Eric Hernandez. With Eric Hernandez, it was all over the place, and I don't even think he even checked out the hard problem of consciousness arguments at all. Oh no, yeah, I listened to part of that and it was painful. And Eric Hernandez was like, "What's pain?" He's like, "I just described pain." It's like, but how do you define it in such a way that it's material? It's like, I just did. It's like, how is that a material definition? It's like, it is. Right. And then they think they're owning the person and they just look like a clown. Dude, no, but serious philosophers acknowledge the problem of qualia. They call it the hard problem of consciousness. There is no satisfying explanation for consciousness on naturalism. Well, here's a great thing, because this was Sam Harris out of his own mouth. And he said, even if you grant that it's an emergent property of the brain, that it's some sort of, once this brain gets so complex, consciousness produces, he's like, this is Sam Harris said, it seems to me like what you are just doing is describing a miracle. You are just saying that something is by definition miraculous. It's like, you got it, man.
I extracted that into a 1-minute clip from one of his podcasts and I put it on my channel where it's him basically saying it's not even hypothetically possible that we could have a satisfying materialistic explanation for consciousness, because at any point, whenever you figure out like, oh, at this stage consciousness enters, it would just seem like magic. Like you break a glass and you know the glass is sharp because you analyze the chemical substructure and you can see what makes it sharp. Carpet is springy. You can look at the molecules and the way they're arranged and you can see this is why carpet's springy. But you can't, there's nothing about matter that could even hypothetically produce qualia.
Right. Totally. And he's saying, you have a snippet of him saying something similar to what I just said?
Yeah. I've got the clip on my video. I can put it in the chat. Anyway, I better get going.
Yeah. All right. So you want to say goodbye to my audience?
Yeah, cool. Thanks for hearing our discussion. And I look forward to more of them.
Yeah. I'll have you on anytime. So you're going to run?
Yeah. Cool. Thanks for that.
Okie doke. Take care.
Yeah.
And